Notification came at 7:14 in the morning while I was still in the driveway. I hadn't even put the car in park yet. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat and I glanced down out of habit. A transaction alert from my bank. $263 at a sporting goods store on Route 9. I hadn't bought anything on Route 9. I hadn't bought anything at all that morning. I'd been in the car since 6:45, driving to the bank before work like I did every Tuesday. I sat there with the engine running and stared at that number. $263. I knew right then. Not the full picture, not yet. But the way you know something is wrong before you can explain why that feeling settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water. I went into the bank anyway. I had an appointment. But I wasn't thinking about the appointment anymore. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 64 years old. I worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the county, and I have owned my house outright since 2019. I paid it off early. That's the kind of man I am. I check my statements. I balance my checkbook. Yes, still, on paper, every month. My first wife passed 11 years ago, and after a few years of being alone, I met a woman at my church's fall fundraiser. She was warm. She laughed easily. She had a son from her previous marriage, who was 29 years old and living, she said, between situations. I thought I understood what that meant. I didn't. We got married in the spring 3 years ago. I want to be fair when I tell this story, because fairness matters to me. She was not a bad woman in every way. She cooked Sunday dinners. She kept the house tidy. She called her elderly mother every single morning without fail. There were things about her I genuinely admired. But there was her son. I'll call him what he was to me in those early months, my stepson. Later, I stopped using that word. It started to feel like a lie. He was 29 when his mother and I got married. He was staying with a friend at the time, which I was glad about. We needed space to build our marriage without a third person in the house. That's what I told her gently before the wedding. She agreed. She said he was getting himself together. She said he had some leads on jobs. She said it wouldn't be an issue. 6 weeks after our honeymoon, he was sleeping in my guest room. The story she told me was that his friend's apartment had a mold problem and the landlord wasn't fixing it. Could he stay with us for a month, maybe 6 weeks, just until he found a place? He was looking. He had interviews lined up. It was just temporary. I said yes, because I was trying, because she was my wife and he was her child, and I did not want to be the man who turned his back on family. 1 month became 2. 2 became 4. The job interviewers she mentioned never produced a job. What they produced were explanations. The position was filled internally, the commute was too far, the pay wasn't worth it. I had a new one every few weeks. I stopped asking after a while, because every time I asked, the air in the house got heavy and she would look at me with something between hurt and accusation, like I was the one causing problems by noticing them. He was not malicious exactly. That's what made it hard to name. He didn't come home drunk or get into trouble. He kept his room reasonably clean. He helped carry groceries once in a while. He was just present, all day, every day, in my house, watching television on a set I bought, eating food I paid for, using electricity I paid for, and contributing exactly nothing. I want to tell you what I saw when I came home from work in those months, because I think it matters. I would pull into the driveway after 8 or 9 hours of managing county drainage projects and contractor disputes, and I would see the living room light on, and I would know he was in there. Same spot on the couch. Same position. The TV always on something loud, and my wife would be in the kitchen, not making him get up, not having the conversation I needed her to have, just working around him, like he was furniture that had always been there. I started staying late at the office. The finances started slowly. That's how these things work. Slowly enough that you can talk yourself out of your own instincts. My wife and I had agreed before the wedding to keep mostly separate accounts with one joint account for household expenses. I deposited a set amount each month, $1,800, into that joint account, and she deposited what she could from her part-time bookkeeping work, which was typically around $600. The joint account was for groceries, utilities, household supplies. That was the agreement. The first time I noticed something odd, I told myself I had miscounted. The joint account was lower than it should have been in October that first year. about $340 lower. I went back through the transactions and found a charge at an auto parts store I didn't recognize. I asked my wife about it. She said her son's car had needed a part, a sensor, something, and it had been urgent and she'd handled it. I said I wished she had talked to me first. She said she hadn't wanted to bother me. I let it go. I shouldn't have, but I let it go. By the following spring, I had let go of quite a few things. A charge at a clothing store I didn't recognize, cash withdrawals that didn't line up with anything I could account for, $60 here, $90 there. Once $220, which she explained as a dentist bill for her son because he didn't have insurance. And what was she supposed to do? Let him suffer. I want to be honest with you. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that a 30-year-old man without insurance and without a job should be figuring these things out himself. I said something softer. I said we needed to talk about a budget. She said I was making her feel like a child. That was the first real fight. It lasted 4 days of cold silence and ended with her apologizing and me feeling like somehow I had still done something wrong. Nothing changed. The TV in the living room was a 42-inch set I'd had for 6 years. It worked fine. One Saturday I came home from the hardware store, and there was a new television on the wall, 65 inches, still in the process of being mounted. Actually, her son was standing on a stepladder with a drill, and my wife was handing him screws, and they were both smiling at each other, and neither of them looked at me when I walked in. I stood in the doorway of my own living room and looked at this television that I had not purchased and had not agreed to purchase. Where did this come from? I asked. My wife said they'd gotten a good deal. Her son said it had been on sale, like that explained it all. Her son said it had been on sale, like that explained it. I asked how it was paid for. She said she'd used the card. The card was the joint card. The card that was supposed to be for groceries and utilities. I asked how much it cost. She told me $740 after the sale price. I want you to understand something about what happened inside me at that moment. It wasn't just the money. It was the fact that they had planned this, bought it, driven it home, and started mounting it on my wall without one word to me, in my house, without asking. And they were smiling. I went to bed early that night and I did not say another word about the television. My wife's son had a car, or 2018 sedan that he'd bought or been given. I was never entirely clear. Sometime before his mother and I married, the registration and insurance were in his name. That was one boundary I had held from the beginning. I would not pay for his car. In January, he came to me and said the transmission was slipping. He said a shop had quoted him $2,300. He said he didn't have it. He looked at me with his mother standing slightly behind him, and I understood exactly what was being asked without anyone asking it directly. I said I was sorry to hear that, and that I hoped he was able to work something out. He walked away. His mother followed him. That evening she came to me in the kitchen and said that she felt I didn't see her son as family. I said I cared about him. I said I also believed that a 30-year-old man needed to solve his own car problems. She said, he's struggling. I said, he's been struggling for 2 years. When does the struggling turn into doing something about it? She didn't answer that. She went to bed. 2 weeks later, I found a charge on the joint account for $1,800 listed as a wire transfer to an automotive repair shop. It had been initiated from her phone using the joint account's online access. I sat with that for a long time. I looked at the transaction 4 or 5 times to make sure I was reading it right. Then I called the bank and confirmed it. Then I sat some more. I did not confront her that night. I waited. I waited because I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing before I said anything. I also waited because I had learned over 2 years that confronting anything in this house directly produced defensiveness, tears, and silence, but never change. And I was tired. I was 63 years old and tired in a way I had not been since the hardest years after my first wife died. And I didn't have the fight in me that I once had. But I also wasn't going to keep pretending. I printed the statement. I kept a copy. I started a folder. What I found over the next 3 months, when I really started looking, was worse than I had let myself believe. I went back through 2.5 years of joint account statements. I made a spreadsheet, not because I'm dramatic, but because I'm an engineer, and that's how I process things. I categorized every charge. Groceries, utilities, household, unaccounted. The unaccounted column was $11,400 over 28 months. I checked it twice, then a third time. $11,400. Some of it I could partially explain. The television, the car repair, the dentist, various smaller things. But much of it I could not trace to anything specific. Cash withdrawals from an ATM near his gym. Charges at stores I'd never visited. 3 separate charges at a particular restaurant on Friday evenings, always between $40 and $90, always when I had been working late or away. I sat with that spreadsheet for a long time. Then I looked at the online account settings and found something I had never set up myself. An authorized user profile for a debit card linked to the joint account. The card had been ordered 14 months ago. It was not my card. The name on the authorized profile was not my wife's. It was her son's name. I don't know how to describe what I felt in that moment, except to say it was very quiet inside me. Not rage, something colder than that. Something that had stopped hoping for a different answer and was now just looking at the truth steadily. He had a debit card to my joint account for 14 months. I called the bank that afternoon and had the card deactivated and the authorized user removed. I did not tell my wife. That night at dinner, nothing happened. We talked about the weather. I said I might repaint the garage. She mentioned a book she was reading. Her son sat across the table from me and talked about a podcast he liked, and I nodded, and I was perfectly pleasant. And every few seconds I thought about the number $11,400, and I ate my dinner. I didn't move fast. People my age don't move fast, not because we can't, but because we've learned that slow and thorough is better than quick and incomplete. I spent 3 weeks preparing. I opened a new checking account at a different bank entirely, one my wife didn't know about. I had my direct deposit moved to the new account. I ordered a new card. I moved the majority of my savings, which were entirely in my name, to the new institution. The joint account I left open with a minimal balance. Because I wasn't ready to close it yet, and I didn't want to trigger anything until I had spoken to someone. I made an appointment with a family law attorney. I did not tell my wife about that either. The attorney was a small woman with a very direct manner who had handled divorces for 40 years and had clearly heard everything. I showed her my spreadsheet. I showed her the authorized user documentation. She looked at it for a while without speaking. Then she said, "This is financial misconduct. Depending on how the account was structured and what your state's marital asset laws say, you may have remedies here." She walked me through my options. She said the priority was protecting my assets going forward, which I had already started doing. She said the next step was a conversation. I drove home that evening thinking about the conversation. The morning the transaction alert came in, the $263 at the sporting goods store, was a Tuesday in early March. I had been to the bank that morning to complete the last steps of transferring my primary accounts. The alert came through on the old card, which I had not yet fully deactivated from the joint account's secondary access. I went into the bank. I sat with the branch manager, a man I'd known for years, and I finished what I'd come to do. By the time I left, everything was moved. The joint account had $82 in it. My new account had everything else. I drove to work. I got through the day. I did not check my phone more than usual. When I pulled into my driveway that evening, I could tell immediately that something was different. There were 2 cars parked in front, my wife's and her son's. Her son was usually gone in the evenings, or at least I assumed he was, though I'd stopped tracking his schedule months ago. Both of them being there at 6:15 with the porch light on and the front curtains open. It had the feeling of something staged. I sat in my car for a moment. Then I got out. They were both in the living room. My wife was on the couch, arms folded, and her son was standing near the window, which is where he always stood when he was trying to look calm and wasn't. I had noticed that about him over 3 years. He stood near exits when he was nervous. My wife said, "We need to talk about what you did." I set my bag down. I took off my jacket and hung it on the hook by the door the way I always do. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, and then I came back and sat in the armchair across from her. "All right," I said. She told me that her son had gone to use his card that afternoon and it had been declined. Twice. She told me he'd been embarrassed. She told me that she had tried to check the joint account online and found that the authorized user access had been removed and the balance was nearly empty. She asked me what I had done. I want to tell you that I prepared a speech. I didn't. What came out was just what I'd been thinking for 3 weeks, said plainly, without raising my voice. I told her what I had found. I told her about the $11,400. I told her about the debit card in her son's name that I had never authorized. I told her the exact date it was opened and the exact amount that had moved through it in 14 months. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Her son looked at the floor. That told me something. My wife said that money was for emergencies. I said $263 at a sporting goods store on a Tuesday morning is not an emergency. She started to say something else, and I said gently but clearly that I wasn't finished. I told her that I had spoken to an attorney. I told her that I had moved my accounts and that the joint account would remain open with a small balance that reflected my proportional share of household expenses, and that any charges beyond that would require my prior approval, in writing, every time, no exceptions. I told her that her son had 30 days to find his own housing. I told her that if she chose to leave with him, I understood, and I was willing to have a fair conversation about how to handle the marriage going forward, but that the current arrangement was over as of that night. Her son said, "You can't just kick us out." I looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in months, and I said, "This is my house. I bought it, I paid it off, and my name is the only name on the deed. You have 30 days, which is more than the law requires in this state, and more than you've earned." He didn't have an answer for that. My wife was crying by then. Not the loud kind, the slow kind, which was harder to sit with. I had loved this woman. I had stood in a church 3 years ago and made promises, and I had meant them, and it was not easy to sit in that chair and feel those promises dissolving. I want to be honest about that. I am not a hard man. This was not a satisfying moment. It was just a necessary one. I said, "I'm sorry it came to this. I'm genuinely sorry, but I have to protect myself, and I should have done it sooner." She said, "I didn't think you'd find out." And there it was. Not, "I was going to tell you." Not, "It wasn't what it looked like." Not even, "I made a mistake." Just, "She hadn't thought I'd find out." I nodded. I stood up. I said I was going to take a walk, and that when I came back, I expected a reasonable conversation about next steps, and that if she needed time before that conversation, I could give her until the weekend. I put my jacket back on and walked out the front door. I walked around the block twice. The neighbor's dog barked at me through the fence the way it always does. A kid across the street was shooting free throws in the driveway. The street lights came on while I was walking. Normal things, good things. I thought about my first wife, the way I sometimes do when I need steadiness. She was careful with money, not anxious about it, just careful, respectful of what we'd built together. She used to say that money is just time. Time you worked, solidified. I've thought about that lot over the past 3 years. $11,400 is a lot of time. I thought about the attorney's words, "Protect your assets going forward." I had done that. Whatever happened next, and I knew the next months would not be simple, the foundation was no longer being eaten from underneath me. That mattered. When I came back, my wife was alone in the living room. Her son had gone upstairs. She looked older than when I left, which I knew was only the light, but still. We talked for 2 hours. It was not a good conversation. It was not a bad one either. It was the honest kind, which is the hardest kind, where two people look at what they've been pretending and decide whether there's anything left underneath it. By the end, we had agreed to certain things. Her son would begin looking for housing immediately. She would no longer have any form of access to accounts I had not explicitly shared with her. We would meet with a mediator before deciding anything permanent about the marriage. She asked if I still loved her. I thought about it for a long moment, because she deserved a real answer rather than a quick one. "I love who I thought you were," I said. "I'm still figuring out who you actually are. And I think you've been doing the same with me." She didn't argue with that. Her son moved out 38 days later, 8 days past my deadline, which I noted but did not press, because the important thing was that he moved. He found a room in a house share about 12 miles away, which he could apparently afford just fine, which told me the inability to afford things had always been selective. My wife and I are still in the same house. We are still married technically. We are working through it, which is not the same as saving it. I want to be clear about that. Some days it feels like something that can be repaired. Other days it feels like a house with a cracked foundation that looks fine from the street. I go to the attorney every few months. I keep my account separate. I check my statements every week, every single transaction, and I will do so for the rest of my life. A man in my position, my age, my circumstances, doesn't get unlimited chances to rebuild. I know that. I also know that being 64 does not mean being finished. It means being careful in a way you maybe weren't at 30 or 40. It means knowing what your time is worth. What I know is this: I paid for that house. I paid for the car in the driveway. I paid for the television on the wall that I never chose. I paid for 3 years to be treated like a wallet with a name. And I decided on a Tuesday morning in March, watching a transaction alert for $263 appear on my phone in a bank parking lot, that I was done paying for that. Some decisions are quiet. Nobody announces them. There's no argument, no dramatic moment. There's just a man sitting in a car looking at a number on a phone and understanding, finally and completely, exactly what is happening to him, and deciding it stops today. I've thought a lot about the sequence of things, not to punish myself, but to understand it. Because when you reach my age and something like this happens, you don't get to just be angry and move on. You have to actually look at it. The truth is, I let it go on longer than I should have. Every time I looked away from a charge I couldn't explain, every time I accepted an answer that didn't quite add up, I was making a choice. I told myself I was being patient, being kind, being the bigger person, but patience and avoidance look identical from the outside, and I confused them for too long. What I've come to understand is that what happened in that house wasn't sudden. It was gradual, which is exactly how these things survive. A small withdrawal here, a charge explained away there, a television on a wall I never agreed to. Each individual moment was manageable, uncomfortable, but manageable. It was only when I finally put them all in a row, in a spreadsheet on a Tuesday night at my kitchen table, that I could see what they added up to. $11,400. And more than that, 3 years of my own silence being used against me. My first wife used to say that the way you treat small things tells everything about how you treat big ones. She was right. The small things I let pass were not small things. They were tests I didn't know I was taking, and I kept passing them in the wrong direction. Here is what I believe, not because anyone taught it to me in a classroom or a church, but because I've lived long enough to watch it play out over and over in real lives, including my own. The choices you make consistently, over time, become the life you're living. There is no mystery to it. My wife's son spent 3 years choosing not to work, not to contribute, not to build anything. That didn't make him a monster, it just made him someone whose habits would eventually collide with reality. The collision was always coming. I just happened to be the one who stopped moving out of its way. And I had to ask myself, hard, why I had kept moving out of the way for so long. Part of it was love, real love, for a woman I had genuinely believed in. Part of it was the particular exhaustion of being in your 60s and not wanting any more upheaval, not wanting to be the person who blows up a life he worked to rebuild. But part of it, I'll be honest, was that I had gotten comfortable with not looking too closely, comfortable enough that someone else was counting on it. That's the thing about intelligence. It's not just what you know, it's what you're willing to see. I had the skills to find what I found. I'm an engineer. I know how to read a spreadsheet. What I had to develop was the will to actually look. That took longer than I'm proud of. What I'll carry forward from this is simple, not bitterness. Bitterness is expensive and I can't afford it at 64. What I'll carry is clarity. I know what my time is worth now. I know that love is not the same as surrender. I know that protecting yourself is not a betrayal of the people you love. It's the minimum you owe to the version of yourself that worked for 31 years to build something worth protecting. I walked around the block that night after the conversation and felt the cold air on my face and thought, whatever comes next, I did not spend my life building something just to hand it away quietly in small amounts, in the dark, to someone who never once thought I'd notice. I noticed, and once you start noticing, you can't go back to not noticing. That's not a loss. That's the only way forward.